As promised, this is the second of 3 or 4 videos I'm putting together for the second rotation of the color theory and rendering rotation in Larch 151. So this one's just going to go through an overview of the Photoshop interface. So don't worry about the image on the screen. This is actually exercise 3, so a little sneak preview of what you're going to be working your way toward by the end of the 5 weeks. But I just put it up here so it allows me to demonstrate a few things about the interface. So hopefully this won't take too long to go through. I don't want to belabor it, but I'll encourage you after you listen to this or as you're listening to it to actually take a look at Photoshop and go through and familiarize yourself with the various parts of the interface. It tells you a lot about how the software works, and as I mentioned, there's certain things you just need to know, so when I say click on this panel menu, you know exactly where to find it. The quicker you become familiar with that, the quicker everything will work in class and outside of class. So I think what I'll start with is just go through the menus. Whenever I open a new piece of software for the first time, I always look at the menus first. It just gives you an understanding of the structure of the program. So I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about what's in each of these menus, why it's set up that way. There are a few things that are unique about Photoshop that tell you something about its nature. Now, Photoshop itself is basically pretty much the world standard for image processing software. And it's designed to work with raster images, and that's one of the things that you need to become familiar with, and you'll hear it again in several courses. There's basically 2 kinds of drawings that we work with in landscape architecture: vector drawings and raster drawings, or images. And a vector drawing would be something like something you would create in AutoCAD or SketchUp or Rhino, which basically uses geometry to describe everything. So a rectangle is simply a point for the upper left-hand corner, a point for the lower right-hand corner, a description that those points are connected by lines going perpendicular directions, and they have a certain line weight or characteristic or line style. Because vector work or drawings are defined by geometry, they're infinitely scalable. So you can take that rectangle in AutoCAD and scale it from being 1 by 2 feet to 1 by 2 miles or 1 by 2 million miles. It doesn't matter. It simply changes the geometry and expands it to meet the new parameters that you've set in. So vector geometry, vector drawings are very flexible in that respect, but they have some limitations. You can't get the subtle differences. So a rectangle, for example, in AutoCAD, you fill it with a color or maybe a gradient, but you can't really do much else. What you see in front of you on the screen is a raster image in Photoshop, and it looks a lot like something you would do with markers and pencils. And all the detailed shading and variations in color, those are created by a matrix of pixels. And if I take this and zoom in on it, and I keep zooming in, you can actually see the individual pixels, which is an acronym for a shortcut for picture elements. So this image is made up of a whole series or whole matrix or grid of picture elements or pixels, and each pixel has a different color in it. And when they're combined together, your eye kind of blends those into a seamless color. And that way, one of the things about a raster image versus a vector is that it isn't infinitely scalable. In fact, you never want to scale raster images, or rarely want to scale raster images up or bigger, because it's kind of the analogy I use is like blowing a balloon up halfway and painting a picture on it, and then blowing it up twice as big as it was when you painted the picture. What's going to happen? Well, the paint's going to crack, it's going to split, there's going to be gaps in between it because you only put enough paint on there to cover the area half that size. So when you double it, there simply isn't enough. The paint doesn't stretch. Okay, there's only so much paint there, and that's the way a raster image is. If you look at those pixels that I just zoomed in on, if I could count them all the way across this image, there's a fixed number of them. And so if I try and make the space between this one and this one bigger, there's no information there, right? They can't fill another pixel in. Well, Photoshop can fill another pixel in, and it will. And it does its best, but still you're limited. So raster images give us a lot of flexibility in terms of really nice shading and different qualities that we can apply to it. But we do have to think about their resolution. And I'll come back through all the menus, but if I go to the image menu right now and image size, you can see that this, if I put this in pixels, pixels, You can see that this is 2,550 pixels across and 1,575 pixels high, and the density of that matrix is 150 pixels per inch. The higher the resolution, the more tightly packed the pixels are. So that gives you the ability to output a bigger picture, but it doesn't necessarily improve the image, or it does actually allow for a little more detail as well. For most of the things we work with, 150 pixels per inch will be good. Anything lower than that really isn't high enough resolution. Anything higher, you don't really see the benefit when you print it. So ultimately, and on the screen, you can't display it that high. So basically, that gives us a good average, and we'll talk more about that as we get into working on exercise 1. So I'm not going to belabor that point right now. Okay, so first thing, this is raster-based program, and it's designed to work with images. And so let's see how that works out in the menu structure. File and edit are pretty standard and everything, right? So this has to do with open, closing, saving. There is an export function which we'll use to kind of take a Photoshop image and export it in maybe a JPEG or a PNG file. And we'll talk more about that. I'm not going to go through that now. I'll do that when I get back next week. So anyway, that's fairly standard. Edit, same thing. One of the things that you'll see, interestingly enough, is once in Photoshop, we've got cut, copy, paste, but we also have copy merged. We have paste special, which includes paste in place and paste into or paste outside of. And you'll learn what those things are as we go through this. But again, copying and pasting becomes important because we're always dealing with just those individual pixels. And in the edit menu also, we can fill, stroke, all the transformation tools. That's what we call these. So this is the transform or free transform, and then there's a few other special and unique ways to transform elements. And things like the preferences are down here, which we may talk about when I get back as well. So other than the standard file and edit, the first menu you get to is the image menu, which you kind of would expect, right? I said it's a raster-based image processing program, image editing program. And so it has an image menu. That's the primary thing that you're working with in Photoshop. And it has different modes, and we'll talk more about these. We're always going to work in RGB for red, green, blue. That gives us 24-bit color, so we have 8 bits per channel. 3 channels is 24. Later on, I'll talk about CMYK, which is really a different color space model for printing and for paper. This is for screen, this is for paper, and we'll look at the connection between those later on. In here, the adjustments menu, you're going to use this a lot, from adjusting brightness issues to color issues to being able to put specialized filters, replacing color, desaturating color, all those kinds of things. So that's another menu that we use a lot because we're always making adjustments to images and to the colors one way or the other. Layer is the next menu. Layers are super important in Photoshop. I think they came into play in version 3 of Photoshop, and it really made a huge difference in how you work with things. We're going to use layers extensively. I'm going to teach you to use layers for everything you do, and there may come a point where you decide, okay, this is too many layers, I'm going to collapse them or merge them down, and that's okay. But as you work, layers give you the most amount of flexibility and options to be able to manipulate different parts of an image, and that's what we want. Flexibility that gives us speed and editability as we're working through the finishing the image. There's lots of different kinds of layers. We actually have smart objects, video layers, 3D layers. We're not going to have time in this 5 weeks to get into all those. I'll talk maybe about a couple, maybe smart objects, because if you import or place an image into an existing document, it turns into a smart object, and you have to understand what that is and how to rasterize it if you need to. The next one is type. We're not going to spend any time dealing with type in this rotation. You'll learn more about that when you deal with InDesign and maybe a little more in Illustrator. Photoshop, you can add text in. We're going to focus on the images. So that has a type menu and a type tool, but we're not really going to deal with that. This is one of the ones that's really interesting to me. I don't think I know of any other software that has a select menu. And the reason that's really significant is because, as you can see, with a bunch of pixels, as I've already demonstrated, or picture elements, if you want to manipulate something, you have to tell Photoshop what it is. You have to select that, just like if you're typing in Microsoft Word, you have to select a letter or a word or a phrase or a sentence or a paragraph. You have to tell Word, okay, I want to edit this, I want to change the font of this much of this text. Well, Photoshop works the same way, and selection becomes a critical technique in terms of extracting images from photographs that you might reuse in a photo montage or in a perspective rendering. Um, And it also becomes important in terms of manipulating parts of an image and not all the image at the same time. So it's really important that there is a select menu, and we'll come back to this one often. Filters are really kind of a fun thing that really I don't use much in dealing with photographic imagery, but when we do rendering, filters can actually take photographs and change them so they look kind of like freehand renderings. In fact, the tree that you see right here on the screen, this was a photographic image with a filter applied to it. So it makes it look like it's a little more of a watercolor. So we can use that leverage photographic imagery to help us do renderings that still look freehand and have freehand components, but it saves us the time of having to do all that manually. I mentioned the 3D. There are 3D layers. Talk about this briefly, maybe just do a quick demo of it later on, but we're not going to have time to get into that either. But actually it's kind of an interesting and powerful tool if you want to explore that on your own sometime. The view menu just tells us what things we can see. So right now you can see I can see the rulers and the extras. The rulers at the top and the left side. The extras include guides that you see on the screen here that can help us line things up or keep things aligned. Next is the window menu. This one you want to come back to just because I'll talk about the panels. And sometimes the panel you want isn't showing, and you can come back here and turn that off or on in order to. So if I want to see the layers, I can choose it from here and it pops that out. I can also click on this layers icon and pop it out. We'll get to that in a second. Okay, so that's the basic layout of the menus. We use several of those that I mentioned quite a bit. Lots of different ways to get to these different options in Photoshop as well. So we'll come back to that as we start working a little bit more. But just be familiar with the layout of those basic menus and what's grouped within them. You also notice, like in any software, if, let's see, for example, all these copy paste are grayed out because I don't have anything selected. Now, if I come in here and make a selection, now I can do copy, cut, copy, merge, clear. I have different options because I've actually activated a tool that allows those options to be possible. So pay attention to your menus. If they're grayed out, that means you haven't done something right. It gives you a hint if you're trying to figure something out that's not working, how you might be able to resolve that. Okay, let's look at the tools, two things together really. The toolbar over here, which if you like it wider, you can double it up and click that and make it one column depending on the size of your monitor. And we're going to look at the options bar up here because these two things kind of work in conjunction with one another. And once you pick a tool, you always want to look up here. So essentially you pick the tool, set the parameters, go to work. That's the sequence I want you to think about. One of the things they took away from the interface recently were little, let's see if we click on this, you can see in the menus there's lines that kind of group similar commands together, which is really helpful to understand that these things relate to each other. They used to have similar lines in here to group tools together. For example, the move tool, this selection, different selection, crop, those were all kind of selection based tools. And there was a little line right here that said, okay, these group together, these things are related. For some reason they took all those lines out, so now it's just one big long list of tools. But I want you to start thinking about, okay, there's a set of selection tools, there's a set of painting tools, there's a set of kind of modifying tools down here, and what we're we're mainly going to use the first half of this, although we may pick up a couple other tools here and there. So the other thing you need to notice is flyout toolbars. If you see a little triangle, which pretty much all of these have, and you click on it and hold the button down, you'll see tools fly out. That means there's something else embedded in there. So example, if I said, I want you to get the gradient tool. Well, if you look at this, you can't see a gradient tool. I happen to know that if you click on the paint bucket, the gradient tool is also in there. So if I've used that last, that's what's going to appear on the screen. So now if I said, well, I want to use the paint bucket, well, you have to click, hold this down, and go to the paint bucket tool. Okay, so just become familiar with, in here we've got the lasso, the polygonal lasso tool, magnetic lasso tool. So there's kind of extra groups, simplifies the interface. And if you know that that's one of several tools, then you just have to click and wait for those to pop up. Now, if I switch from, let's say, this selection tool, you'll notice in the options bar, I've got a bunch of different things. So I've got, these options are for new, replace selection, add to selection, subtract, or difference. This tells me whether I want the selection feathered or not. If I wanted a certain fixed ratio or size, I can set that, which will activate these. And then this is an option, once I've made a selection, if I want to mask it and refine it, I can do that. And that's actually a new feature in 2016. It was the basic tools were in Photoshop, but they've organized it a different way. So if I go down to this, you can see that this lasso selection tool actually is set on add because that's the last time I used it, I had it there. So when I go here, it's back to replace. Here it's on add. So each of these tools maintains its own options, and the options change. When I go down to my paintbrush, now I've got a whole different set of options up here. I can control pressure sensitivity with a pen, adjust opacity or flow. I can pop up a list of all the brushes I have here. I can pull up the brush panel if I want to make changes to a particular brush. So that option bar is very important to pay attention to. Every time you switch tools, there's some other options that are going to be up here that you want to make sure you've got set appropriately for what you're trying to accomplish. Down here, we've got the color pickers at the bottom. So if I click on this chip here, I can move around and pick a color. Now the reason there's two is because basically I have a foreground and a background color. So the background color usually is set to white. That's what it will erase back to if you start erasing, and sometimes you can use that to just set two different colors that you're using. And if you want to swap them, the paintbrush is always going to work with the foreground color. You just click this little arrow and that swaps the colors. So it gives you kind of a way to hold two colors if you're working back and forth between them. We also have different modes, kind of standard screen mode, which is what we're in now, full screen with menu bar, full screen mode completely. Now it's always going to ask you, it's going to go full screen, you're going to lose everything because it doesn't want you to figure like, how do I get back there? Well, you just hit the escape key and it comes back there. So that's just different ways to display things on the screen. Another helpful option if you're working on smaller monitors is if I have any amount of windows or the toolbars open here, if I press the tab key, all that stuff disappears. So if you're really just working on the drawing and you don't want to see anything, you can hit the tab key, pick a new tool, choose a layer, hit the tab key again, and just go back to working on the painting. So you don't have to have that there. So that's a nice, instead of collapsing and folding these things in all the time. The work area that you see here, I can zoom in and out. I actually have my preferences set so I can use the wheel of the mouse. On the Wacom tablets, we actually have either a slider or mine has a little circle on it that I can zoom in and out with. If I hold the space bar down, let me zoom in a little bit. If I hold the space bar down, I get the pan tool, and we usually set the pen so that the upper button activates the pan tool. So if you're zoomed in to see detail, you can still move around easily, but the space bar will activate it as well if you have another tool actively using like the paintbrush or the eraser or something like that. Let's see. Also, I have a couple different drawings open. Here's a plan that with a kind of a quick method that you'll learn next year in Larch 251. But Photoshop by default organizes drawings into these tabs at the top so you can go back and forth between them. You can go up to Window and go to Arrange and say I want two up horizontally, and it'll put them in two separate windows so I can go back and forth that way. If you need to look at both of them at the same time, if that happens or you do it accidentally, which somebody did the other day, just go down to Consolidate All to Tabs and it will put them back up there. This is becoming a more common interface. It used to have maybe a window menu with a list of open files, but now everybody's kind of using these tabs at the top of the screen in order to jump from one document to another. Okay, the last user interface element I want to talk about are these panels. And the panels are what you can get to from the window menu. So all these different things in here. We won't use all of these in the course of the next 5 weeks, but we'll touch on quite a few of them. So as I said, if you ever are looking for something and you don't see the icon, look in the window menu. Now, these panels are kind of docked over the side here, and I can expand them by just dragging this out. If you expand them enough, you can see the text. And if you click on this, it actually opens up and has all the information available there. I tend to not want to use them that way because it takes up too much screen real estate. If you're a beginner and you're not familiar with Photoshop at all, you can extend these out enough so you can see kind of the names. I've been using it long enough, and after a while, it won't take you long, but I'd rather just push these down so I can see the icons. So I know that's the swatches panel. I know that's the layers panel. I know this is the brush settings panel. So there's not that many of them that you need to use. And if you don't use some of these, like device preview, I don't really need to use that. I can take that and drag that off and close it and just get it out of there so I don't need it. I think these are, so this is the history panel. You can back up through the history if you want to. So that's kind of something that you can customize. And the initial layout of this is determined by a workspace. And if you look up at the top right here, somebody did this, or actually I did this myself the other day. Somehow I switched into 3D mode and it changed some of the tools. But what we usually keep it set on is just the essentials. That's the basic tool set. And so if you ever see these change or something happens or something disappears and you want to reset it, you can kind of switch from one workspace to another and it should reset it back to its original form. So these panels are really important because we'll use them a lot. For example, the layers panel. Each of them have settings, sometimes at the top and the bottom, sometimes just the bottom, but you just look for these settings. These are, like here, it's make a new layer group, delete a layer. The other thing that's really important is this is what is called the panel menu. It's a small icon that if you click on it, it pops up another menu that you can work from to do certain operations. Also, you can right-click on some of the layers and you get a context menu that also gives you several options. So that's pretty standard on anything. You see the swatches is a little simpler panel, but there's create a new swatch, delete one, but there's also a menu. So you can load in preset groups of color swatches like the Pantone colors, other things that that you might want to use. So be familiar with that because we want to use those. I'll be referring to that. Click on the panel menu, go down halfway, choose this option. And so you just need to be able to be familiar with navigating around the screen. Another couple shortcuts or another shortcut you can use, as I mentioned, this is in the view menu. If I uncheck extras, that line will disappear. Sometimes I want to see it, sometimes I don't. And it's not really on a layer, it's kind of an extra thing that floats over top. But I can use Control H to hide that. That will also hide a selection marquee. We'll talk about that next week. But that's the tab hides the toolbars. And then the Control H hides any of those kind of temporary extra items that you might want on the screen for some time. This one happens to represent the horizon line in the perspective. Okay, so that's basically the overview that I want to do now. I'll talk more about image types and image compression and some of those other things, but I'm not going to do that now. I think it'll be better once we start working with the images. And next week, you'll be able to understand that a little bit better. But I would like you before Monday, the 3rd, to sit down, walk through Photoshop, especially if you're familiar with it and you've used it before. Usually most people have used Photoshop a little, although not everybody. There's always quite a bunch in each section that haven't used Photoshop before at all. Those who've used it, I rarely get anybody who says they consider themselves an expert in it or are really proficient. So if you've used it but you haven't used Photoshop CC 2016, I would take another look at it. Just go through it and make sure you understand where everything is, how it's laid out, and how to get to some of those options.